So the first two unique causes of scope limitations that we're going to talk about, and the scope limitations again are events or occurrences within the audit engagement that prevent the auditor from doing their job in obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Okay, so to simplify this situation that we're going to focus in on here first are situations where the issue is not management's fault and situations that are management's fault. So starting with situations that aren't management's fault. So here we're saying that if an event occurs that is out of management's control or relating to the nature or timing of the auditor's work. Okay, so an example of a situation that is not management's fault could be if a natural disaster happens, like a hurricane, and it destroys documentation related to the client's inventory, and the auditor no longer can use that documentation to perform enough substantive testing to obtain reasonable assurance. Okay, so that's a situation that isn't management's fault, and it's an event that occurs that is out of management's control, obviously. All right, so the second type of situation that isn't necessarily management's fault, that does still result in an audit issue, could be related to the nature or timing of the auditor's work. So a few examples of this could be something like late appointment of the auditor, right? If the auditor is appointed late in the financial period, it may not be feasible to observe things like the counting of physical inventories or complete other necessary procedures within the required time frame. Could also be due to geographical limitations, right? If the entity has operations in locations that are difficult to access due to logistical issues or political instability that prevent the auditors from performing necessary on-site procedures, also not management's fault. So in a situation where a scope limitation exists that isn't management's fault, what should the auditor do? That is what the exam is going to test you on. And in this situation, the auditor should determine whether it's possible to perform alternative procedures. Right? Is there anything else that they could do in lieu of what they were going to previously do to still obtain that sufficient appropriate evidence? Are you struggling through the audit section of the CPA exam? The audit section is tricky, and unless you've been an auditor for 20 plus years, this stuff can feel like a foreign language. That's why Universal CPA Review offers a unique, bite-sized visual learning approach that's going to help you retain the information longer and process it faster. If you like the content in this video, feel free to sign up for a free trial with the link in the description below. You can also sign up for our live group tutoring communities where you're going to have the opportunity to interact with the CPA exam instructor as well as your peers. You can also sign up and access those communities with the link in the description beneath this video. All right, so the second scenario is if the limitation is management's fault. All right, so this is also known as a management-imposed scope limitation. In other words, management is simply refusing to cooperate with the auditor and provide them with the information that they need to obtain that sufficient appropriate evidence. These are very often referred to as management-imposed scope limitations. Okay, so our buzzwords here are management-imposed. So this might be significant issues that arise that necessitate an expansion of the audit scope, and management refuses, and we're thinking that they're potentially doing this to avoid the discovery of errors or fraud. Then we're saying, yo, you guys are a little bit sketchy. This is outside of our comfort zone. We need to do something about this. So what do you need to do? That is what you need to know for the exam. So we have three parties here that we need to consider. We have Detective Lucy, who's our auditor. We have Max, who represents management of Accrual World, and we have Accrual World's oversight squad, right? This is the objective party that is known as those charged with governance or the audit committee. All right, they're once again those who hired the auditor. Okay, so Lucy needs to make some communication now that she's sketched out with management's refusal to give her the information she's looking for. So step one is Lucy needs to first ask Max at Accrual World, aka management, to remove this scope limitation. She's basically saying, hey, this is unacceptable. We need to do this to do our work. And if Max says, sure thing, no problem, great, problem resolved. But let's say that Max absolutely refuses to remove the scope limitation. He's like, we're just not doing it. Sorry, figure it out. Well, number one, that's annoying. But number two, it's still unacceptable because it prevents us from obtaining audit evidence that we need. So in this case, Lucy's got to be like, I didn't want to have to do this, but I'm now going to have to tell on you guys. So Lucy now has to go tell the oversight squad, aka those charged with governance, who is in effect Max's boss, that management is just not giving us the information that we need. So she needs to communicate with them and see if they could do something about it and convince Max to give us the information that we need. And if that's just not happening, then we need to work with those charged with governance to determine if alternative procedures are possible. All right, in step 3, we now need to determine if this resulting effect for management's imposed scope limitation is considered material and pervasive, which we know is the most severe problem. And if this is going to be considered material and pervasive, then we've gotten to the finish line and we now have 2 options. We can either disclaim an opinion, which is option number 1, or we could simply just walk away. We can withdraw from the engagement. That's option number 2.
Okay, so when it comes to audit issues, one of the most common scenarios that you're going to see on the exam, and one that might just sneak up on you, is a situation where management has imposed these scope limitations, and the exam asks you what the auditor should do. So know this mental map, because this is going to be a step-by-step approach that will get you to the right answer. So once again, in step 1, the auditor should request that management removes the limitation. And if management refuses to remove that limitation, you need to ask yourself, so what should the auditor next do? Well, they're going to have to tell on management, all right? So now they're going to have to engage with those charged with governance and explore any other alternative procedures. And if there just aren't any alternative procedures that can be performed, now the auditor is in a pickle. They now have to assess the potential impact of this management-imposed scope limitation and determine if any misstatements will be undetected from it that will be considered material and pervasive. And the final step in your mental map, if it gets to this point, is knowing that the auditor has 2 options. They can disclaim an opinion or they can withdraw from the engagement.